Diverse communication styles. You guys probably thought you were coming to like a diversity workshop. You're not. We're going to talk about diverse communication styles as it pertains to generational differences. So I'm going to teach you how to talk to young people, how to talk to old people, why we seem to combat each other and butt heads, because I'm guessing you probably don't think like your parents think, right? Yes, y'all do? Yeah? No, okay. We need active participation here. This is like we are doing this workshop. And are you all going to be teachers someday? Is that the game plan? No? What are you going to be? Physical therapist for children. Are you all going to work with children one day? Yes, that's our common, yes, maybe? No? What are you going to do? Business administration, that's fine. This applies to you too. Those of you that are going to be teachers, obviously you need to learn how to, talk with your kids, your students, the young ones. And that generation of people has yet to be named, people that are born after 2002, whoever, and I honestly don't know whoever it is, but these names come out kind of after the generation has reached kind of mid-teens and 20s. But you're also going to have some other folks that you have to deal with. How many of you in this room are Gen Y, based on the dates I have here? Born between 1982 2002. The large percentage of you. How many Gen Xers do I have? 1965, 1981? God love ya. Baby boomers, 1946 to 64. Yes, we have some representation. I don't have any traditionalists, I'm guessing. Born between 1925, 1945? Probably not. But tell me, so you're going to run into students that are Gen Y and the next generation to come. But who are your parents going to be that you have to talk to? Pardon? Gen Y, Gen X, baby boomers. Yeah, you're going to still have some boomers that are parents of your students. What do you think your co-workers, the other teachers in your school, or your principal, or the administrators are going to be? Boomers and X, yeah. So it becomes really important to know how to communicate with them and to kind of have a feel for where they're coming from. Because everything we do, think, breathe, feel is based on kind of what we've soaked up so far in the number of days that we have lived. It's everything from what language you speak, to what your national heritage is, to what street you grew up on, what school you went to, what college you're going to, what TV shows you watch, what commercials you see. We all just kind of soak up information. Whether we want to or not, we are sponges. I'll give you an example. If I say the word Nike, what do you think? Shoes, swoosh, LeBron James. Y'all have something that you thought of when I said Nike. Now, you're all intelligent human beings, correct? All right. Now, since you're intelligent and you have free will, you may choose. I would like you to choose to not think that thing when I say Nike. Can you do that? Next time you hear Nike, just not think shoes? No? Yeah. What? You can maybe if you take a little time, make some conscious effort. But if I catch you tomorrow morning at 8:30 and say, hey, where are your Nikes? You're going to say, oh, is she talking about shirts? No, you're going to say, oh, she's talking about my shoes. Because that's kind of our default thing that we soaked in about that brand. None of us at any time ever had to sit down with the Nike play manual and say, okay, Nike shoes, Nike shoes, Nike shoes. No. Just over time, during our years that we have lived here and seen advertising and billboard signs, listened to the radio and podcasts, we have soaked that up. And there's a lot that we have soaked up that influences in ways that we aren't even aware of. So we're going to talk about what some of these folks have soaked up during their time, during their formative years. When I say formative years, I'm talking about those teenage to college years. What was happening during that time for these folks. Do I have any history buffs in the room? That was kind of a quick hand raise over there, and it quick went down. I have one history buff. Okay, we're going to have to help each other out here, because we're largely shaped by what was going on during our formative years. Our traditionalists, which, maybe on Grandparents' Day, you're going to have some traditionalists come in the room. So you will still have to interact and deal with them. They might be volunteers, reading mentors for your students. But for these folks that were born during 1925 to 1945, what was going on in America's history at that time? World Wars, Depression. What else? Prohibition. That meant no drinking. And I can't spell. How do you think that shaped some of their values? If you probably have grandparents that grew up and talk about the Depression. How did that shape their values? More thrifty, frugal, absolutely. These are the folks that don't throw away anything. These are the people that had to make skirts out of potato bags because you didn't throw away anything during those years. You saved it all and found another use for it. Tell me about the baby boomers. What was going on during their formative years? Vietnam? What else? JFK, disco. What else? Korean War. When I was doing this presentation for faculty, and then most of the room was baby boomers, they all said sex, drugs, and rock and roll was kind of what they remembered. Sex, rock and drugs. That's what those formed. It was a formative time of experimental, living. This was the time frame when the very first women's movement started. This was when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke and was assassinated. This was when the civil rights movement was happening. So there was a lot of change going on for these folks. A lot of change. What that ends up doing for their value system, if they are seeing, that they're making a difference and that they're living through an era of change, they kind of have an I can do it feeling about life. I can do it. So their values tend to turn then to, I don't have to save everything, but if I want something, I can go out and get it. I can do it. I can actually make a difference. The civil rights movements were showing us that they could make a difference. Gen Xers, what was happening during our formative years? Cold War. The very first computers. We didn't have Google, we had Gopher. Do you guys even know what Gopher is? You don't. Oh, that's painful. Okay, what else was happening for the Gen Xers? More drugs? Yeah, maybe. Not quite as much. I mean, we didn't have any Woodstock things going on. More crime? Yep, crime was on the increase. Nixon. Tell me a minute about family values. I don't have that as one of my lists here. But tell me about family values a minute back here. What do you think their motto was as far as family goes? Strict, respect, stick together, mom stays home, all of that. Mom's job was to stay at home, take care of the kids. What do you think the divorce rate was during this era? 0, yeah. exactly. This is back when they still whispered, divorced. We couldn't say that word out loud. In fact, really, even during the baby boomer era, there was some divorce, but it was not I don't want to say popular, but it was still something that was somewhat whispered. During the Gen Xers era, the whole notion of divorce and blended families really came onto the scene. Over here, when we had the women's movement, women were starting to say, hey, you know what? I don't have to stay at home. I can go to work. But that really didn't come to fruition until the Gen Xers came around. They kind of paved the road so that with this generation, we suddenly had dual income homes where both mom and dad worked. You know what they called the kids during this era? Does anyone know? We were called latchkey kids. Do you guys know what that means? Yeah, it's because the kids were coming home to empty houses. We knew where to find the key. It was usually tucked under something. And we really were on our own from 3 until 5:30, which this generation, if you're free on your own from 3 to 5:30, what's that going to be like? Yeah, the crime rates go up. Yeah, kids are getting bored. They can do anything. But they're very independent. Suddenly mom's not around anymore when you're growing up. So you can become very independent, even if it's for a short amount of time. Tell me about your generation. What has happened while you've been here with us? DVD. September 11. Others? Internet. Come on now. What just happened a few months, or in January? First black president. Pardon? I have that here because it's happening during this generation's formative years. Do you see what I mean? You get it? All right. What else has happened? Cell phones. How old were you when you got your first cell phone? 16? 15? Anyone younger than 15? 18? 12? Okay, we've got 12. Anyone can be 12? All right. How old do you think your students are when they get their first cell phone? 5, 6, 7, 10? Yeah. Okay. I don't even want to say how old I was when I got my first cell phone. We're talking like 32, 33, and it was the big one, It was not something small and slim. It was huge. In fact, I wasn't wealthy enough to have a car phone, which was physically inside the console of your car. You couldn't take it with you. So yeah, I'm going to put car phones over here because that was high tech. What else are you guys living with today that your parents say, whoa, we didn't have that when we were kids? iPods, thank you. Traditional families change a lot. How is it right now? Yep, divorce is up? Or is, yeah. Yep, so we've got dads raising. In some homes, In the back corner, you're saying something else. Yeah, family diversity.
There's a lot more acceptance, like sexuality, substances.
Yep, absolutely. I'm just going to put down acceptance. Yeah, because when we brought somebody different home back in these eras, our dad let us know we brought somebody different home. So that's given us a pretty good kind of overview of what was happening for these folks. But let's take a look at how it's going to affect maybe their communication style, how they prefer to communicate, how they prefer to work. You know, if you were raised during the Depression, what is your view of work going to be? Labor. You know, it was a lot of manual labor. Depends on your gender, because most of the workers were men. First job, yeah, any job, because you're lucky to get that. Do you think they worked just a real quick 35, 40-hour work week? No, they worked till the work was done. Period. You worked till it was done. And when do you think they played? Never, or at least not until Sunday or the work was done. Tell me about Sunday. Church. You ever gone to your grandparents' house and not been allowed to ride your bike? No? My generation, which is Gen Xers, you know, if I was at my grandparents' house over here on a Sunday, I couldn't turn on the TV. I couldn't ride my bike. I mean, Sunday was the day of rest. We didn't even dream of going out to dinner or going to the mall or going grocery shopping. I mean, Sunday for these folks was rest. And so when I was with my grandparents, that was absolutely what had to be observed. One thing I don't have on here is dress. How did people dress back in this age? Women wore dresses. Always. Always. And the men wore suits or coveralls. You know, depending on your work. But when you would, you know, go somewhere, really anywhere, you were dressed, from our standards today, you were dressed up. A lot of that carried over then with the boomers as well. For them, their work ethic was changing a bit. They were starting to think, you know, maybe women could be. Because they were growing up when, you know, anything is possible. We put men on the moon kind of during this era. You know, we said it in 1961, happened in 1969. You know, anything was possible to these folks. How is that going to change their view of work? You know, are they going to walk in and say, I'm a factory worker and doing manual labor for life? Are they going to maybe start thinking about climbing the corporate ladder? Like it's possible that they could be something different than what their dad was or their grandfather was? You know, they really started thinking about possibilities. Gen Xers. You know, this is the era of dual income homes. We're just starting to get some computers. What is your experience so far of Gen Xers? This is where your teachers are falling for the most part right now. What is their attitude about work? Dedicated. Are they putting in the 80-hour work week? Yes, no? No, not as much. You know, some are. But this is when you start hearing about balance, you know, between work and life, or work and family. You know, suddenly we're realizing these folks just worked to death. These ones worked because they needed the money. They needed to put food on the table. These folks worked, you know, the 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks because anything was possible. And it was the person that worked the 70, 80 hours that got the corner office. You know, here we start thinking, wow, you know what? When I grew up, I was a latchkey kid. I don't want my kids to feel like latchkey kids, so I'm going to try and balance work and life a little bit. Tell me about you guys. What's your outlook on work? Spit it out. Unemployment right now, yes. Say it louder. Education is a must. Yeah, I don't have education on here. Yeah, education over here was unheard of. It was very rare. Both of my grandparents had an education. Both of my grandfathers had an education through 8th grade, and then they stopped and had to go work on the family farm. Here you have people that are finishing high school and going on to college, still not a ton of advanced degrees, but there's definitely an increase for those going to college. Here, college becomes an expectation because now we have parents that have probably gone to college. College is more of an expectation. But for you folks, it just has to happen. Over here, it was a real privilege to be able to go to school. Whereas for you guys, it's, do you have a choice? What's going to happen if you don't go to school after high school? You're not going to get a job. That's right. What do you look for in a job? As you guys go out and think about where you want to work, what's important to you? Benefits? What? Tell me about hours. Work around your schedule. I am so glad you said that. Work around, and I'm going to put UR, and how do we abbreviate schedule? Work around your schedule. Notice the shift there. Prior to that, we lived, our life was kind of worked around our work schedule. But I really appreciate that, the hours have to work around my schedule. I have a daughter right now who's 17 who desperately wants to be employed because she wants money. But she really doesn't want to work on weekends because that's when she gets to see her boyfriend. And, he works until 5, and so maybe if I can find something that goes from after school until 5, but on Tuesdays and Thursdays I tutor at 4 o'clock, so I really don't want to work on those days. So I put down on my application that I could work from 2:30 until 5 on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, but I'm just not getting any jobs. And I don't want to babysit kids all the time. Yeah, I'm just looking at her going, what language are you speaking? When I was looking for a job, I took whatever I could get. Sundays, Saturdays, Fridays, you just took it because that was money. And I'm thinking she has definitely not hit rock bottom yet. Because for her, it's still work. Well, I want to work around my schedule, which absolutely cracks me up. And I'm just kind of letting her ride this one out. So yeah, definitely shifting as we go. Now, if this happens to be your tendency or even your experience with your peers, and you're working side by side with a baby boomer who's staying at school, grading papers and filling out the report cards until 8 o'clock at night, they see you take off around 4:15 after the buses pull out, what do you think might be going through their head? Slacker. Are you slacking? No. You got your work done. You've got life outside of work. You're going to go live now. But the communication that's happening, and it's not because you're doing anything or they're doing anything, is slacker. Meanwhile, what are you thinking when you see the lights still on at school after you're driving back at 8:30, from the grocery store or wherever? Workaholic, unhappy relationship. They're avoiding going home. They have no life. And none of that necessarily is true. Right now, they're just working based on where they're coming from, what they soaked up during their formative years meant you worked, because that's how you got further ahead. And what you've soaked up is, hey man, I gotta live. Work is something I do between weekends. And these folks are trying to balance, you know. They kind of get both sides a little bit, but they're trying to balance. If your principal, who's making decisions on what classroom you get, what grade you get to teach next year, if your principal is a boomer and they see you leaving at 4:15 when the buses pull out, what might happen in the workplace? You're not going to get the room you want. Or you might get Johnny, you know, the kid that's really naughty. Because the appearance will look like you might not be working very hard. What's important for everyone to know is there's not any right or wrong answer on how many hours you have to work, how late you have to stay in the school building. But it's important to know that we all kind of come from a different angle based on, you know, what we grew up with. Let's talk about communication. The traditionalists, well, they really didn't have a whole lot of different ways to communicate other than face-to-face letters. How long did a letter take, do you think? Too long. Wait, how long? Couple weeks. And then after you put your letter in the mailbox, you sent it off, when do you think you heard back? A month. If they wrote you back on the day they got your letter, you might hear back from them a month later. It depends on where it's going. Yeah, if you're going overseas, forget it. If you're going from here to California, you're still waiting quite a while. Canada, my letters would get lost in Canada. So yeah, communication took a long time. We didn't watch TV back in this era. We listened to the radio. You know, you remember those old movies where everyone's huddled around a radio to listen to a show? That was the entertainment and communication. Any transaction that happened was face-to-face. You know, you go to the bank, you physically go to the bank, you pay out with real dollar bills, or they hand you real dollar bills back. You signed for it, and then you had the transaction. You recorded it in their book, they recorded it in their book, and every month you made sure your books matched. Okay? Everything just took a while. Laundry took a while. So I'm trying to get across this, you know, time during this era, and really as we go into the boomer era, time was, you know, we'll get around to it, you know, take some time, kind of hear phrases like that, you know, when I have time, I'll get to it. How did our boomers communicate with each other during this era, once we were kind of hitting this stage? Telephone, absolutely. What hours? Well, first of all, what did the telephone look like? None of you kids even know. Tell me, what did the telephone look like? Rotary. Do you guys know what a rotary phone is? Has anyone ever used one? Oh, I'm so proud of you. Was it like in a history class or no? Do you really? Awesome. A rotary phone, for those of you that don't know, has all these little circles that are the size of your finger. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And you had, you know, your phone up here with a cord. And you would have to dial, and it would spin around. And then it would, and then go da 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 da, and then you did the next number da 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 da, and it just absolutely sucked when you got to that 6th or 7th number and you misdialed because you had to start all over again. And yep, go ahead. Over here for the traditionalists and for maybe the younger years of the boomers, It was, and they had what they called party lines, which means the whole street's on the line. Everybody's kind of talking over each other, and you hear everyone else's conversations. That was called a party line. But yeah, for the boomers and Gen Xers, when I was a kid, we had rotary phones. Now, we were beginning, for the Gen Xers to get, the real wealthy families had the push-button phones. I always had a rotary phone, and I remember being so jealous because we'd have, I think they still do this contest on the radio, where if you're the 9th caller, you get to win 2 tickets too. And if you had one of these phones, by the time you even got the number dialed, they were already announcing the winner, because all those folks with the push-button phone got it. And they had the redial button too. That was a huge deal. Okay, but our boomers are communicating with telephone, so are Gen Xers. If we had relatives that lived across the country, when did we call them? Once a week. What time? After 9. Why? Because it's cheaper. Or we could call them before 6. We could call them before 6 or after 9 p.m. because the rates went down. Okay, this is like peak and not peak hours for cell phone users. We paid a lot more for those non-peak hours. For the peak hours, sorry. So we would still, when we talk about when did we communicate, we still waited until 9 o'clock if we had to make a urgent call to a loved one in California. We still wrote letters during this time. It might take a letter maybe 3 to 4 days now to get across the country, but it still took time. And we had to write in cursive. Are you guys even going to have to teach your students cursive? Probably not. You teach them keyboarding now. When I was in high school, I still had typing class. But our communication is getting a bit more sophisticated as we kind of move across this line. It's a bit faster. We're not just writing a letter or doing a face-to-face. We might be able to call the bank and get some information, maybe. How many people in your house could be on the telephone at once, or how many different calls could you have going on at once? One. For the most part, we still had these cords. And so if you were having a private telephone conversation, now think about this, junior high, high school, having a private conversation, you had to stretch that cord all the way around so you could get in that first floor bathroom and shut the door so you could have a quasi-private conversation, knowing full well that your little brother or sister could pick up any other phone in the house and hear what's going on. Okay? All we had was landlines. What do you guys have? You're just saying at age 15, 16, you're getting cell phones. Yeah, if somebody doesn't pick up their phone, what's the next thing you're going to do? Text them, right. And how long do you, when you call somebody and they don't pick up and you're like, I've got to get a message to them, how long do you wait from when you've called them to when you then text them what you want them to know? About 30 seconds right after you hang up, right? Time suddenly is like tick-tock, tick-tock. I need a response. What's the average wait time for a text message then reply to come back to you? No, but what if you're communicating with your friends or your family? Yeah, you expect a reply within a minute or two, right? Any longer than that, you think they didn't get my message. I'm going to have to send it again. Oh, really? Okay. So we've got some technology that needs to catch up. All right. But for us Verizon wire, users, we can even see that it was delivered because it's got the little D that shows up. It's like, yes. Suddenly our response time isn't a couple weeks or a couple months on information. Our response time that we're expecting is, instant. A minute or two, I want you to be able to communicate right back with me. So now you are a teacher, Gen Y. You're talking to a Gen X or a baby boomer, and you send them a message, hopefully they know how to read a text message, right? So you might then leave them a message on their phone too. But it isn't uncommon for these folks yet to wait for a day or two to respond. That's what they're used to. You know, over here we didn't have answering machines yet, where you could leave a message. Here we did. Some of the homes did, not all. But again, when you start thinking about time and turnaround time for information, you know, a day or two is like, you know, when I have a friend who is from this generation. I'm from here, and just even the difference between he and I'll talk to him, or he can read text messages, and he'll say, I'll call you later. Okay, in my mind, or in your mind, if somebody says, I'll call you later, when do you expect them to call? A couple of hours. Later that night. That's what I was thinking too. For him, it's like, well, later. Like later this week. You know, just later. Like I'll call, it's like the same as saying, I'll call you sometime. You know, later. Doesn't mean just in a couple of hours. You know, so if you have a teacher that says, well, I'll get back to you later, know that their later doesn't work on the same time frame as yours. It might be helpful to articulate, hey, rather than I need these permission forms, you know, signed and returned to me later, tell them I need them signed and returned to me tomorrow or by this date. Because the minute you start using terms like later, that all becomes relative to what your perception of time is. Tell me about technology. You know, how many of you have had computers in your home since you can remember? No? When did the rest of you get computers in your home? Fourth grade?
I was 5.
5.
Started here.
Huh? Oh, started here, yeah. Others of you, when did you have the first computer in your house? 6th grade. So really, yeah, for many of you, you've kind of always had a computer around. Was it a big deal to learn how to use the mouse? Well, no, you just use the mouse, duh. I mean, I spent years in my other job teaching people how to click and drag, because that was such an absolutely brand new concept. And I worked at a college in town, and I would tell them, you know what, go back to your offices and play solitaire for an hour so you get used to clicking and dragging and then releasing it. Clicking and dragging. We weren't even using the right click on our PCs yet because that was a bit much. But that's where your boomers are at. You know, they have learned technology now, maybe in grad school, but definitely after high school. You know, the most computers I had in high school was a typing program that would tell me how fast I was typing. But that was it. And it wasn't Mavis Beacon or whatever ones. Is that the one you guys use now? Yeah. You know, it wasn't fancy or anything like that. It was just, you know, this DOS screen, this black screen with white letters that would tell you your score. But when you think of putting together your lesson plans or your activities for your kids, what are some of your main resources that you're going to have your kids research on? Their computer. Yeah, internet. When they go home and need help with their homework, who are we expecting to help them? We're expecting a computer, but if they can't get their computer where they need it, they're going to say, Mom, Dad, can you help me with my homework? And it's going to say things like Google da-da-da, Skype this person, you know, podcast, listen to this podcast. And you're going to have parents that just kind of go, You know, now some of them are going to be very savvy, you know, because they've had to learn it for work. But others are going to be like, you know what, I don't like technology and I don't have to use it. I'll still walk to the bank or drive to the bank. But you're going to have to figure out how to bridge that gap because that's who you're going to be working with. You're going to have coworkers who are still using the lesson plans that they used in 1982 because They were still teaching, social studies in 1982. Granted, they had to add some more information, but, they might still, these are people who are used to using that, what is it called? What was when we made copies like this? The ditto machine. That's right, the ditto machine. And do you guys know what a ditto machine is? You had 3 pieces of paper, and you could either type on it or you could write on it. And you pulled out the middle carbon one. Now, if you made a mistake, that's just too bad because you can't erase. Because it's that 3-ply paper, and you've made an indentation all the way through. And then you have to go to a machine, and you manually run it off like this. And if you were the lucky kid that got to pass out those papers, okay, folks that are my age, what did you do? You smelled it. You're like, it's fresh off the machine because it had this ink, high-quality smell to it. We'll just say that. You wanted to be that kid. But, it's not going to be uncommon for you to see people that are still making copies, from their ditto machines or from their old lesson plans. That's not going to be uncommon at all. Or the way they taught it back then, with a chalkboard and chalk worked. Why do they need to do a PowerPoint presentation? I guess what I'm getting at is you're going to have a very different style than probably your coworkers. You're going to have a different style of working with your kids, of assigning homework to your kids, of teaching to them, of coming up with lesson plans. I was reading an article that absolutely blew me away. It was called World Without Walls, and it was referring to your generation as the collaboration generation. And it says, earlier this year I was listening to a presentation by an 11-year-old community volunteer named Laura. And she was talking about service projects that she carries out in her hometown of Buffalo. One of the audience members asked her how she got her ideas. And her response was, well, from my readers. Now, do you guys know what I mean when I say from my readers? What was she doing? She was blogging. She had readers. In fact, she had a ton of readers. She had readers from all over the United States. They were kind of contributing and commenting on her blogs about service projects. And that's how she got her ideas. Okay, now just that notion to you is like, well, duh, I can talk to anybody anywhere. But for these folks, I mean, that's just dumbfounding. And I know it's hard for you to grasp, but that is so, out of our experience. But those are the folks you're going to be working with, and those are the parents you're going to be working with. So you've got to figure out ways to bridge that. Gender roles. Back here, somebody brought it up earlier. Gender roles. Tell me what you think they were like for these folks. Males worked. Males were it. Period. Men dominated the workforce. How about for baby boomers? Starting with it, but not much. But what could women do? Women could be secretaries or teachers. That's what women could do. So we were starting to have women. We could be secretaries or teachers or nurses. And the way we see this play out now, when I say nurse, for the most part, we think of a woman. In fact, then we also have to have the word male nurse when we're referring to a nurse that is male. Just like we talk about a female doctor. Because if you just say doctor, you assume male. That's changing rapidly for you folks and for the kids that you're going to be teaching. It used to be when we said president, we meant old white guy. That's right. That's no longer the standard anymore. We have a new standard. When we talk about who's running for the presidency, you can't think old white guy. By the time these kids are grown up and your age, they're going to be like, well, of course anyone can run for president. Duh. It's going to be limitless. Over here, a woman wouldn't have thought of running, or a person of color running for president. It just wasn't possible. Our gender roles were very defined. Racial roles were still very defined. And we see that disappearing as we get, to the Generation Y and and generations after that. But remember that your parents and your coworkers are going to be here. I have a husband who is a 6th grade school teacher and works in a school in town, but he notices, so he's a Gen Xer, works with a lot of baby boomers. And even though they know better, one of their gut instincts, and this is harsh, but when they think of the kid that's going to be trouble when they look at their classroom, who do you think they're picking out as the trouble kids? Pardon? Boys. What else? People of color. Yeah. Because that's what they soaked up when they were growing up. Yeah, we're separate but equal, but not really so equal. That's still what's going through a lot of their heads, unless they've been through a ton of progressive training sessions and really picked up a new way of thinking. Unfortunately, that is disappearing with every generation. It's getting less and less. One of the things you guys brought up was, family diversity, but diversity of friends, diversity of sexual orientation, all of those things are just kind of, we just expect it now. So that is changing, but it's not going to be the case necessarily for the people that you work with and the parents that you work with. Don't be surprised if you have Caucasian parents who are a bit concerned with who their child is playing with. That's not going to be uncommon, and you're going to have to come up with ways to handle that very tactfully in a way that perhaps can educate them a little bit, rather than going, oh my gosh, they're so racist. They came from an era where that's what they soaked in. I'm not excusing their behavior by any stretch, but I want you to know that you're going to run into that, and you got to be ready for that in a way that can, maybe spark new thought for those parents or those peers that you're working with. Let's see. What else are you guys thinking? I'm trying to aware of the time. It's almost 4:30. Thoughts, questions?
I have a question.
Yep.
When there was racism, I grew up, my grandparents were racist.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up not being racist.
Mm-hmm.
So they thought I was strange.
Right.
Growing up. Now, it's not uncommon. Where I sit, it's not uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
There's nobody racist.
Mm-hmm.
But you get your own generation, even before
Right.
the transition one, they're really, really
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah, it's not always, poor intended. It's what they, soaked up. In my own experience right now, I happen to be going through a divorce, which my parents just cannot understand. Okay, they've been married. We just celebrated their 50-year anniversary. They cannot understand why I'm going through divorce. In fact, the other day I heard from one of my siblings, well, do you think MB is gay? And that's why she's getting a divorce? And I'm like, oh, it's like they just don't get it, So that's what they're thinking. And, and then what do they do if they find out I'm gay, or something like that? I mean, it's just a completely different mindset over here. So I'm trying to explain to them, no, it's just not working out. But the values back then was, well, you stuck with it even if it wasn't working out. It wasn't about working out. It was about you married this person, period. Till death do you part. Yeah.
Do you think nowadays people are trying to go back more towards family traditions?
A lot of the research has started to say that, because you've got, these folks here that, my generation that grew up as latchkey kids, we didn't see our parents much. Our parents were, boomers or traditionalists, working until 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I mean, my father would come home at 5:15. We ate at 5:30. Our meal ended at 6, and by 6:30 he was back in the office. And that was the norm at our house. And so then what ends up happening as my generation becomes parents, they think, well, I want to, get that balance again. I want to be with my kids more. In fact, the way that we raise kids right now is different than we've ever seen before. Punishment in the classroom over here, what did that look like? A paddle or a ruler to the hands. I mean, if you got sent to the principal's office, you were honestly scared. Okay, now when you're sent to the principal's office, you're going to have kids saying, I'm going to have my dad talk to you. You can't even touch me. You know, we've got students walking around with an attitude, and parents that will, probably back up their kids. When I was a student way back in the day, I wouldn't have thought of defying my teacher. They were right because they were the teacher. Period. It didn't matter if I was right. They were right because they were the teacher. Whereas now, parents are listening to their kids tell a story, and they're really going, oh, well, I better take this up with the teacher or with the principal. You have a lot more interaction that way with parents that you didn't before. And so that's changing. I used to do playground duty when my kids were younger, and I was astounded at how the children would speak to me. Because when I was, a little kid on the playground, you respected your elders, period. It was Mrs. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so, and that was it. Whereas, I talk to these kids on the playground, I'm like, hey, you know what, let's not, do this and this. Why, what you going to do? I'm like, shoot, I don't know. Probably not much because I can't do anything or it's against the law. All of a sudden I'm like, ugh. But you're going to have that because kids just aren't even, it's just very different. Other comments or questions or insights? Things you're dying to share? Yeah. Yeah, television. How many channels do you get to choose from? Yeah, depends on what you're willing to pay for. I had 3 on a good day, 3, 8, and 41. But yeah, television is a huge influence. Pardon? Yeah, depending on what neighborhood you grow up in, you might be staying indoors quite a bit. Right. If you look at things like architecture during this era, from the boomers to the Gen Xers, you went from, and you can tell if you're driving through Grand Rapids and you go through some of the older neighborhoods, they all have this classic big front porch, and that's where you'd hang out, and that's where people would watch each other's kids, and you knew all of your neighbors because everybody hung out on the front porch. During this time period, as we were building our suburbs, all of a sudden we started building decks out back. You didn't have the front porch anymore. You went out on the deck out back. And you put up fences then too. And suddenly you don't know your neighbors. If you're going to invite somebody over, you're going to invite somebody over, but you're not having that day in, day out interaction with neighbors like the generation before did. And that, definitely changes then the impact on where kids play, how kids play. If I see a kid running up and down the street that doesn't have an adult, I'm almost nervous. It's like, oh, where's their parent? But when I was growing up, shoot, we took off after school and we didn't come back home till the street lights went on. That was how we knew. And nobody worried about us. We were just having fun. Violence, I'm sure you've done plenty of reading on just the difference in violence that, even you guys have seen versus what I was allowed to see growing up, has desensitized us a lot. One of the pages in, oh no, I didn't hand it out, but I had this sheet that's just called Simple Truths, and it just kind of talks about, we rarely get to pick who we work with. We do have influence over how we react to the people we work with, and that's where understanding this stuff comes in. But there's something, tell me if this is something that you grew up with. See if you can finish the sentence. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's our golden rule, right? Now, if I do unto others as I would have them do unto me, is that going to necessarily work? You know, if I communicate by text messages, and that's my preferred mode of communication, and I text my mom, because that's what I would prefer, is that going to work out so well? No, she's not going to be able to retrieve that message. You know, so suddenly it's, oh, I can't just do unto others as I would have done unto me. It's, you got to think, okay, they're coming from this generation. All right, they probably might prefer a phone call in the evening rather than an email, or, you know, different modes of communication. Keep that all in context when you're thinking about that, because you really want to do unto others as they would have done unto them, which might be very different than what your preferences are. Other thoughts, comments? Oh, come on. You guys are whispering back there. What are you talking about? Is this worthwhile information? How does this apply to you? Right, right. It's not because they're stupid. It's because, yeah, yep. Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you know how people my age used to look things up in the library?
By the card catalog.
The card catalog. You went over, you know, on one floor there was a card catalog. You'd look for your letter, pull that drawer out, and search through these little index cards, like a little recipe box. And if somebody was standing and using your drawer, you just waited and waited. And then when you found your little card and you wrote down the Dewey Decimal and found it in the library, sometimes it wasn't there because somebody else had already checked it out. You did all that for nothing, exactly. But that's how we did research. That's how your parents and your administrators did their research. They didn't just Google it. I mean, I'm going to grad school right now, and everyone my age looks at these websites and goes, how do we even begin to cite this? Because we never grew up writing a bibliography using a website. You know, we knew how to do books and journals. But now to reference a website, I mean, thank goodness the new version of Word has that little reference thing where it does it for you. Do you guys know about that? Oh, it's rocking. But most of your folks aren't going to know about that. So yeah, go ahead.
When you were talking about the do unto others as
Mm-hmm.
you do unto you, like how do you, I mean, I kind of wonder how, like the Bible and stuff that was written so long ago for those times, how are you supposed to adjust to it now?
Oh wow, we could spend a half a day talking about that.
I mean, not even just the Bible, but anything, you know, like that was written so long ago or certain ways. People are still trying to live by that, but I think that's why there's so much political.
Yeah, when you're working with people that are living by values or standards that are no longer applicable, is that kind of what you're asking? What do you think? What do you do with that? Because you're going to have that.
They'll be kind to them.
You know, you're going to have people that are old school. And you're going to have to work with them. You don't have to compromise yourself. I never want you to be in a position where you would compromise your integrity. Right, exactly. There you go. You don't have to agree with it, but you do have to respect that that's their reality, that's their position. Agree to disagree. And some parents aren't going to like that. But you're going to find you've got some parents that are going to love you and some parents that might not. You know, some parents that are going to show up on parent-teacher conferences and some parents that aren't for a multitude of reasons. And it's not just because they don't care, but it could be they're working second shift or third shift. You know, there are so many different realities out there, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg talking about generational differences. But yeah, I do workshops on racial diversity and on socioeconomic diversity. And I realize how much for granted I take that I have a car. You know, because I try and imagine going through one of my days just having a bike or taking the bus. You know, I suddenly can't buy $200 worth of groceries and load them up if I'm taking the bus. You know, so try and as you read things or see things or experience different people, think about, wow, what must their day be like? And how would that influence then how they're behaving with me? Because it's very easy just to kind of go through our day and do our thing and do our thing, do our thing without ever kind of having that broader look. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a broader look. There's definitely more that we could talk about, but in respect of time. Did anyone else have any final comments, questions, things you were dying, I would say, that I didn't? Sure, absolutely. Absolutely.